This podcast discusses murder and domestic violence. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to this episode where I am going to talk about my thoughts on the trial and the whole case and the murder of John Hossack. I'd like to thank everyone who's listened. I feel like the first two episodes were kind of rough. This is the first time I've recorded a true crime podcast, so I wasn't expecting it to be anything amazing. But it was also the first case that I've read about that I found interesting enough and well researched enough that I could actually make a podcast about this. I mean, there's a lot of cases that I find super fascinating and super interesting, but I usually hear them on other true crime podcasts already, and I didn't want to rehash something that's been done a lot, or not even done a lot, but something that's maybe been done way better than I could do it because of the equipment or the talent that these other people have. But this was a case that I had never heard of, and it was something that actually, when I first started reading about it in the book, The Midnight Assassin, I was kind of like, yeah, this is kind of interesting. And the murder happened, and I was like, okay, that's really interesting. And the evidence, that's really interesting. When it got to the trial, I was actually kind of not necessarily bored, but it just seemed to go on for a very long time, and I couldn't remember everything. The book took me a while to read. It wasn't a book that I sat down and just completely breezed through because it was an easy read and fascinating, which I'm not saying it wasn't fascinating, because it totally was, and it was really well researched and well written. But there were parts when I was like, I don't know about this. I'm not sure if I think she did it or she didn't do it, and this is kind of But by the end of the book, when it talked about what happened to Margaret's children, and when it talked about how her case was not reversed, but basically the Iowa Supreme Court was like, there's not going to ever be enough evidence to prove one way or another, so you're free to go. It was just super fascinating to me, and I think what really stuck with me was how she was portrayed in the media and how she was just judged by men who knew her husband, and how everyone just kind of portrayed her as, I feel like I didn't talk about this as much in the podcast episodes, but everyone seemed to portray her as this cold, harsh woman who also didn't look like a woman. But I'm like, what the heck do you mean by that? She had lived and worked on a farm her whole life. She's out there doing manual labor for 50 plus years. Of course, she's not going to be this gorgeous, perfect skin, flawless woman. She's going to be a strong woman who knows what life is like. She's been through a lot of crap. She's not going to be this small, innocent, little rich, happy biddy bimbo or something who is dressed all pretty. She is a hardworking mother who's had 10 children, one of whom died, and she's worked on a farm for 50 years, So, and the media portrayed her as this cold woman who wasn't womanly because of that, and that was really weird. I mean, not necessarily weird, okay, because let's be honest, the media still does that, Oh, this beautiful woman was killed, and this beautiful woman was slain, and oh, this beautiful woman did this, and oh my gosh, you would never have expected it to be her. But this other woman, oh my gosh, not surprised that she did it, type thing. And so I guess it wasn't shocking, but it was just really interesting to see that back in the early 1900s, they were still doing this. And it just resonated with me to how things are portrayed today as well. This woman wasn't womanly enough, and so she obviously murdered her husband. Whereas if you know anything about the Lizzie Borden trial, she kind of, I don't know if she played it up or this was her actual character in real life, but she kind of played up that I'm an innocent girl. Oh, I'm having fainting spells in court. I could never, oh my gosh, that would never be me, Oh, the beautiful young, poor innocent girl. And Margaret Hossack wasn't going to play that up. And so that was super interesting. And I feel like that's honestly what made me more invested in this, was the character of Margaret Hossack, because I do feel really, really bad for her. I'm going to get into the end what I think is most likely what happened, but I definitely don't think she did it. And so she was drugged through this, and she came out not on top. Like, she came out having lost her farm, having lost her husband, and basically having lost her children because a lot of them left after that. And, it wasn't like they could just send her a text every week or day or every 5 minutes with pictures of where they were and how they were doing. Like, you just couldn't do that back then. She lost her family. And that's just, and not even once, she lost her family twice. Like, she moved away from her own family when she married John and started another family with him. And I feel like she lost both of them throughout the course of her life. And that just really made me feel sorry for Margaret. And I just wanted to talk about her and her story. And so that's what made me stick with this podcast and actually want to make a podcast about it and be dedicated enough to do that. So that was a lot of my thoughts, but honestly, I scripted this out kind of a lot because it was my first time doing a true crime podcast, and that probably really shows in the first 2 episodes where I honestly feel like I sounded a bit like a robot. But thank you again for everyone who's made it this far, who has listened. It really means a lot to me, and this was something fun to do, and I really enjoyed doing it. So I hope this case has interested you, and I'm honestly just going to go through my notes and everything that I did episode by episode and just give all my thoughts on everything. So this episode's probably going to be long. It's probably going to be rambling, but it's all my thoughts about everything on the case. Also, because I probably will do more true crime podcasts in the future just for fun. But if you think that I should put my thoughts into the episode instead of having them just in an episode at the end, so if you think I should, like, in the middle of the trial be like, but this is what I think, even though he presented this evidence, if that would make more sense to you and make it seem less like robotic like and just presenting the evidence like I'm presenting in front of a teacher at school with a PowerPoint or something, just, reach out to me, let me know. And I will put my thoughts in like future episodes of podcasts that I decide to do or whatever. Anyway, getting back to this, my thoughts on everything. Let's start with John working for Alexander Murchison. I have no problems with that. Like, it's weird because I don't know if I like John Hossack. He seemed to be a violent man, and I obviously don't like that, but I can also understand his total reasoning of wanting his own land. Not his reason of being a horrible person and a horrible husband and to his wife and father to his children, but I can understand his want to go out and make his own name and have his own land and have his own house and have his own family and really want to just make a life that was his own. Like, I 1,000% identify with that. Yeah, so I can identify with John Hossack when he's a younger man trying to work up and get enough money that he can go out and buy land, which, by the way, I'm like, really? It only costs that much money? Like, holy crap, I wish. Part of me's like, I wish I lived back then. I could just buy land after working for a couple years for some dude on his farm. Like, woohoo, okay. That's not how it works today in America for sure. But I totally understood him doing that. The whole thing with him maybe falling in love with Alexander's older daughter, Jane, but like the weird stigma of the time of she's too old to marry. I wonder if that played into him at all marrying Margaret. I obviously don't know that, and I couldn't find any evidence of that. And once again, it's kind of like hearsay. He was interested in the older daughter, but ended up marrying the younger one. But just pretending that that is true and that he actually was in love with Jane, but she was, quote, too old, or maybe even she didn't like him and rebuffed him. I wonder if that kind of played into him going to Margaret. Because, yes, they did have their first child he was conceived out of wedlock. He wasn't born out of wedlock. But I wonder if, having been rebuffed by the older sister, he went to Margaret and they just did it. Or maybe being rebuffed and not having this older sister, he just turned his eyes to the younger one because she was there. Obviously, I don't know that. Maybe they were totally in love. Maybe John didn't love Jane at all and he just had eyes for Margaret. I have no idea. Wasn't there. No evidence of that. And I'm sure that children being conceived out of wedlock happened, like, all the time back then, and people tried to cover it up. I'm sure it was way more prevalent than people would think. But it is something that, of course, people frowned upon in that day and age, and people still do, depending on what their beliefs are in today's world. I don't care either way, but with that mentality of how people were in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that would have been a big deal. And so I totally understand why they tried to cover that up. And I do wonder, because I don't know people personally, but I know friends who have family who have gotten pregnant by someone and then married them because of that, and it wasn't a good fit. And some of them have divorced and some of them have stayed together. Whether or not they're still happy together, I have no idea. But I wonder if that did have anything to do with tension in John and Margaret's marriage, is that they didn't love each other, and when she found out she was pregnant, they just kind of rushed into it, because you shouldn't have a child out of wedlock in that day and age type stigma. No idea. But I just feel really bad for Margaret. Just, even if she was in love with him, even if everything was fine, she left her family, and except for her older brother Donald, she never saw her family again. And as someone who finds their family super important, that was like really hard for me to read, and really, it just made me feel a lot of sympathy for Margaret Hossack, because she had this family and she left them. She never saw them again, except for her brother Donald, like not even her parents. She never saw her parents again after leaving. Like, how devastating. She never saw her other siblings who she'd grown up with and had come across the ocean from Scotland with. Like, none of those people ever came into her life again. How tragic. Her children never knew their grandparents on that side. Like, I just can't imagine going away and never seeing my family again. And yeah, I get that it was the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it was farish to travel, but it's not like Illinois and Iowa are completely across the country from each other, They're, even in that day and age, I would say relatively close. And she still never saw them, which was really, really crazy to me. And then when she did get to, the land that John Hossack had built, they had to build a house and they had to start their farm. And then she had 10 children. And during this whole time, she was still expected to work. And of course, she wasn't appreciated. It was like, yep, she's doing her duty. She's having babies and taking care of the farm. But oh my gosh, John Hossack is such a good farmer. Like, look at how freaking successful he's become. And he has 10 children, or I guess 9 that survived. 9 children, and they all help him, and look at them. They have their own farms and their own houses and their own families. Like, oh my gosh, he's so successful. And it's just like Margaret, like in the background, being like, yeah, I raised those children. I helped build this farm. If it weren't for me, these children wouldn't be here. I mean, it just, once again, it made me feel for her. She's taken away from her family. She's going to this place she's never been. She has to build from the ground up, and everyone's like, John's great. Margaret who? That's what I feel like. And of course, her losing her son Donald, just devastating, of course. And then her husband being a complete a-hole with bouts of rage and threatening not only her, but her children. I mean, I just can't imagine how horrible that would have been. And you're isolated. It's not like she can walk 20 feet to her neighbor's house and get some help, or just have someone to talk to. Her neighbors lived miles away, so she would have to go walk there, or get a horse and buggy or a cart or something, and go a far distance and travel a bit to actually get to someone to talk to. And then I'll tell you what really bothered me about this is that Thanksgiving, where Margaret ran away to her children's house and then came back the next day, and John exploded on her again or whatever. that those two men, Mr. Keller and Mr. Johnson, came to the house and was like, okay, everyone, you need to be nicer to your dad so that he doesn't get angry. And by the way, never talk about your problems again. Like, WTF, which really, really pissed me off. Like, these two men coming in, like, telling the children to behave, okay, whatever, but telling Margaret to never come to them again and talk about her marital problems. What the heck? Why would you ever, ever, ever say that to someone? Like, oh, yeah, I know you're being abused at home, but please stop telling me about it. And by the way, don't tell anyone because that's unbecoming. Like, it just, it reeks of that stupid, idiotic, like, patriarchal society that ruled back then, but also not even like the patriarchal society. It just reeks of, oh, you have problems? Well, don't tell anyone about them because we have to pretend our life is perfect. And I feel like that's so prevalent today, too. It's like people on social media are like posting happy pictures of themselves when they're on vacation or, oh, I got married and stuff. And it's getting a bit better where we can have discussions in society about like depression and anxiety, but it's not that much better. It's like, oh, you posted that something is going wrong. Like, why would you do that? I only want to see happy things. It wasn't like super shocking, but like it at the same time, I was like, why? Like, it pissed me off and like enraged me that these two men, knowing that her husband's like throwing crap at the children and hitting them and beating them and yelling at her, and she's been complaining about this for years, are just like, don't talk about your problems to us anymore. We don't care. Be nice to your husband because you're supposed to follow everything that he says. And by the way, all his bouts of rage are because you guys aren't acting correctly. Oh my gosh, if someone told me that, I would punch them in the head. Like, and I also just found that interesting because it made me think about, had they actually reconciled? Were they actually living in peace and happiness the year before John's murder? Or was Margaret just not talking about it anymore because people told her not to? Was she just pretending everything was okay because that's basically what the men told her to do? So I feel like that was a really interesting point. I feel like there wasn't enough evidence to prove, even though that was kind of like the defense's big evidence was that they had reconciled. I feel like there wasn't actually evidence to prove that. It was all like circumstantial and like the children being like, yeah, that was great, which they could have been lying, and their neighbors being like, yeah, it was great, but the neighbors not really knowing because they're, one, not at the house all the time, and two, told Margaret to shut the heck up about their problems. So she could have just been pretending that everything was great for a year. So that was super, super fascinating to me. I just feel like everything in this case is like, yep, could have not been true, but could have been true. That was really interesting to me. Moving on to like the murder of John Hossack, like the actual night it took place, I don't know what I think about that. I think if someone else came into the house and killed him in bed, she would have woken up. Even if they didn't hit the bed with the axe, which I'll get to that when I come to the trial part and my thoughts on that. But at the same time, some people sleep like really deeply. Some people have slept through people like going through their house and stealing things, and they've just slept through the whole thing. I mean, there's so much that we miss in life just because we're not paying attention. And some people, like I said, are just deep sleepers. I am not a deep sleeper. If that happened, I would have woken up. I am very like auditorily stimulated, especially at night. So if there's any sort of weird sounds happening that aren't normal, it's going to either keep me awake or wake me up. And so the fact that her defense was like, I was lying in bed and someone came in and smashed him on the head and I didn't wake up during this whole thing, I find a bit iffy. But at the same time, she's older, especially I would say for this time period, and having worked on a farm for her whole life, she could have just been tired. She literally, like, she was working all day. She's in her 50s. She's working all day on the farm. She's working on a farm her whole life. She could have just been exhausted and slept. But I think that if she had been in the bed when her husband was killed with an axe, she would have had a lot more blood on her because there was blood all over the walls, sprayed 9 feet away over the walls. And there was just like splatters of blood on the back of her undergarments. I feel like it would have been all over her, in her hair, on her skin, like not just on the back of her. It would have been all over her, everywhere. If that spray really sprayed that far and got all over like the floors and the walls, I feel like not just the back of her undergarment, she would have just been covered in it if she was lying there in bed next to him. I thought it was interesting that they didn't call for a doctor immediately, but also I'm so used to being like, I can just dial 911 and get an ambulance. Back then, I have no idea what people, one, thought about doctors, and two, if they just didn't go to get a doctor first because they were like, there's nothing we could do. Maybe they already knew that. Maybe they looked at their father or their husband and were like, oh my gosh, he's going to die whether or not we go get a doctor. So let's go get our siblings, get our friends. But I do still think it's very, very strange that they didn't call for a doctor first. Because I feel like even back then, when they're not readily available and you have to go get them, when you see someone hurt like he was, not like, oh, I chipped a nail, it's like your head is bashed in. Wouldn't you go get a doctor first? But instead, who's it, like Jimmy told Cassie to go grab the neighbors first? Like, why? Why? I don't know. It was weird to me they didn't call a doctor first, but at the same time, it's like if they realized that he wasn't going to be saved, yeah, I would go gather friends and family first to come there and make sure they see him before he passes away. But I thought that was strange. Very, very strange. And then, like, the neighbor just totally not coming out of his house because he, he claimed that he saw someone on the porch, but then later in court admitted to lying and saying this because his wife didn't want him to leave. Like, what the heck? I get that Will Haynes, that's the guy who they ran to, May and Jimmy ran to, but even if you don't like this guy, there's two kids there right in front of you being like, our dad is dying, will you please come over? And he's just said, nope. I'm like, what kind of people are they where children are coming to ask you for help? I get that they were older, but still, like, compared to you, these are children whose dad is about to die, and you're just standing around your house being like, nope, not coming out, not gonna help, don't care. That is cold. That is harsh. I don't think Will Haynes killed John Hossack, which was a theory because they had argued a lot and he lived right next door to that. I mean, not right next door. He was their closest neighbor, as far as I know. But I don't think he killed him, and I don't think he was trying to cover up for killing him by staying inside the house. I think he just didn't like him. And so he didn't come. But even then, I'm like, that is really, really harsh and really, really cold. I also think that, like, the dog acting weird is, once again, I'm like, I don't know. It could be this. It could be this. The dog could have totally been drugged. I also feel like the dog could just be out of whack because there's a lot of people coming and going from the house, and he's not used to that. And animals can also just sense things, and I feel like he could have just sensed that something had happened to his master. Everyone else is running around, everyone else is doing things, but John Hossack is not there, coming and going with everyone else. So I feel like, yeah, the dog totally could have been drugged by someone, but it also could have just been nervous, feeling weird because it felt something. Just, it's also the middle of the night. Maybe he's just used to sleeping at that time. And once again, he's a farm animal. I don't know if he was necessarily used for doing any sort of farm work, like helping to herd cattle or anything like that. But maybe he was just exhausted and it was nighttime and he was like, I'm not getting up because I'm sleeping. So, like, you never know with animals. They're animals. We can't talk to them. I thought it was a bit weird that all these neighbors came to the Hossack farm. Like, once they heard what happened, they all rode over as if it was like a spectacle. Let's go watch John Hossack die. But at the same time, we do that today. Except we usually do it on our phones. We're like, oh, this guy got hit by a car. Oh, I can watch it on my phone. Oh, here's a video of lightning striking someone. Oh, I can watch that on my phone. Like, all these horrible, disgusting things we can see with modern technology, they couldn't because they didn't have that. So, of course, they hear that John Hossack is dying. They're going to go over there and see it in person. It could also just be like, once again, they hear that their friend's dying. They want to go over and see him before he dies. I just thought it was weird that so many people came to the house, because I feel like I would have liked to give the family some space, like maybe come and stopped and said goodbye to John and then left and been like, I'm really, really sorry. But maybe they were all trying to be supportive of the family. I don't know. I'm that kind of person who, when I just like to be left alone. Like, if I need someone, I'll go find them. If I don't, I like to be left alone. I'll process things by myself. So the fact that all their neighbors came and just like stayed there until he died was really, really weird to me. But that's me looking with my 21st century eyes. And again, like, they had to physically go there and see for themselves. I thought it was sad that Alex didn't get to see his father before he passed away. I think it's good that all his children were there, even if he was a horrible person. Except for, like I said, I thought it was sad that Alex wasn't there. But yeah, I thought when Johnny found the axe and they were like, oh, there's some blood and some hairs on it, here's the murder weapon, and they didn't look for anything else, I thought that was very strange. But they also did seem to like look and search around the farm for other things, and didn't find anything except for Margaret's, like bloody undergarments, and obviously John Hossack's head that's still there, and the blood splatter on the walls and such like that. But I feel like they didn't actually try to find another weapon. They found the family's axe and was like, yep, this is the thing that did it, and here's some blood on it, and here's some hairs. But it could also have not been that. So, which once again, I'll get to that when my thoughts about the trial come up. It was just, I definitely think they should have taken it into evidence, because it totally could have been the weapon. And I think the sheriff did right by that. But I feel like by just assuming that the axe was the weapon immediately, they just didn't look for anything else that could have happened that could have been used as a weapon. It was just like, yep, oh, here it is. Yep, okay, cool. The same thing with George Clammer, the prosecuting lawyer. Like, when he showed up, he just started doing things. And I was like, maybe that's normal for back then. But like, it was... He just like immediately started questioning Margaret Hossack and probably thought she was guilty from the get-go, and didn't bring the sheriff up, which once again, maybe that was common practice back then. But it was just strange that like this prosecuting county attorney comes and just starts like banging it out like he's Mr. Sherlock Holmes over here or something. That was super interesting. And once again, just like from a 21st century point of view, I thought it was very strange. I feel like I should just get maybe to the trial. I don't think Clammer asking her to take off her dress was super weird. I get that back in the day it might have been seen as scandalous, but he was just trying to find evidence. However, I do think it's really important to point out that the front of her undergarment was clean and the back was not. I feel like if she had been the one to do it, for sure, unless she, for some reason, stood with her back to her husband and somehow smashed his head in while she wasn't facing him with her hands behind her back, smashing an axe that way, the front of her undergarment definitely would have been covered in blood. Because once again, it just goes back to the whole, there was blood splatter all over the walls and on the floor. And so if she had been the one to kill John Hossack and lift that axe and smash his head in, her clothes would have been covered. Absolutely covered in blood. I definitely think that was honestly one of the most important pieces of evidence for me, and it was destroyed by basically them not taking it the night that John was murdered, and her later having cleaned it. I don't think it's strange that she cleaned it. Back in the day, you probably valued your clothes a lot more than you do today. Today you can throw your clothes in the trash, go to the store and buy some more. She had to make her clothes probably by hand, or have pay someone else to do it for her. And so the fact that she has this nightgown that's covered in blood and she puts it in a bucket of water to maybe clean it is not strange to me at all, because she could still use that. Why throw it away if you can still use it? And like, why throw it away when it's so much harder back then to have ready access to clothing? So that was not suspicious to me at all. And I don't think it destroyed any sort of evidence in my mind, because so many people testified later to seeing that the front was clean and the back was not, and the back had blood on it, and no one altered from that. And so even though it wasn't brought as physical evidence to the court for the trial, I feel like this undergarment to me was super important. I'm trying to think. Let's see. I mean, the fact that the axe went 4.5 inches into his skull, I was just like thinking about measuring. I was like, that's like at least like halfway, if not more than halfway into his skull. And I was just like, ugh, the amount of damage that would have done is absolutely absurd. Let's see. I'm literally just scrolling through my document with all my notes on it. So, I mean, to arrest Margaret Hossack, I wasn't shocked by it. She's the most obvious suspect. When someone dies and they're married to someone, it's always the spouse, right? Or not always the spouse, but it's always the spouse who's looked at first because they're usually the closest person to that person. So they would either know the most, usually, or not know the most and be weird, and it turns out they did it. And so having Margaret Hossack arrested, I can understand. But at the same time, it comes back to like that bloody garment was covered along the back, not the front. And she didn't really seem like a guilty person to me. And I will tell you why, because now I'm finally getting to like the trial. I mean, yeah, her husband was cruel and violent and whatever, but she lived with him for 32 years. And unless she was really, really calculating and she decided, like, once those men told her, hey, don't come and tell us about any of your problems anymore, she decided to, like, basically wait and play this long con where she pretends everything is great in her life and then kill her husband. I just don't see her being that type of calculating, like, manipulative type of person where she's like, oh, I'm just going to pretend that everything's great for a year so when I kill my husband, no one suspects me, which if she did do it, it didn't work. Yeah, the prosecution saying that it was hate that drove her to kill her husband. I mean, possibly. Once again, I don't think Margaret Hossack did it. But if she did, yeah, it was because her husband was an awful person to her. And if she did do it, yeah, it probably was. And I don't even know if it would be hate, though. I feel like it would actually be like more love for her children that would cause her to kill her husband because she's just tired of having her children and her be threatened. So I feel like maybe it's not even hate. It's just like I have this bad thing in my life that needs to leave, and that bad thing is my husband. I think George Clammer, kind of doing like this whole recreation thing where like she sneaks out and gets the family's axe, and then I mean, it's probably normal in a court of law to decide what you think happened. But once again, like, the amount of blood that was on her doesn't seem to point to the fact that she bludgeoned her husband to death. And I also feel like if Margaret, here's another thing. So let's say Margaret goes in, whacks him on the head a few times, goes back out to put the axe back where it was, comes back in. If she saw him breathing, that he was still breathing, why didn't she just go grab the axe again and whack him a couple more times till he was like dead? Because I feel like if it was her and that's what actually happened, she would have just killed him. Unless she did it, went out, put the axe away, came back in, was like, oh my gosh, what have I done? Saw her husband breathing and had like this moment of absolute horror and regret and was like, oh, I can't kill him anymore. I guess I better try and get him some help. Once again, I don't see that happening. I also feel like if it was her and she was doing it in the moment, because I feel like it's not like a well-planned murder or anything. It's like he's sleeping in his bed, time to kill him type murder of opportunity. I feel like if it had been her, she would have just kept whacking him. Like if Margaret Hossack really hated her husband for 32 years and had never liked him and had always hated him and he's been threatening their children and threatening her for 32 years, wouldn't you just like expect her to go like absolutely crazy and like a crime of passion type thing where people get stabbed like 37 times or whatever, just keep hitting him on the head with the axe until it's like just completely demolished? Kind of like in the Lizzie Borden case where no, she didn't take an axe and give her mother 40 whacks or whatever, but where it's just like there's just multiple blows so that they're disfigured, and it's like they're just caught up in that moment, not necessarily realizing what they're doing, and so they just keep hitting and hitting and hitting until they finally like stumble back and are like, "Oh, they're already dead." And like, but it's way overkill, if that makes sense. So I feel like if it was a crime like that where she just decided to kill her husband all of a sudden while he was sleeping, there would have been no skull left. It would have just been everywhere. It would have been completely gone. It would have been demolished. And even if it was like she decided to be a cold, calculating person, wouldn't she just hit him once, raise the axe up, come down, whoop, boom, it's into his skull. Awesome, I'm done. George Clammer's whole story about how she calmly went in and then came back and saw that he was still breathing, but just didn't whack him with an axe again when she saw that he was alive, but instead came up with a story like, no, if she killed him and she wanted him dead, she would have just killed him. She would have gone back out and grabbed the axe, or she would have gone and grabbed a pillow and put it over his head, like face, and smothered him or something. I don't think she did it, and I thought it was super interesting of George Clammer to be like, if John's lying on his left side and Margaret's lying on her right side, they're back to back. How could someone reach over her and hit her husband with an axe, but her not be hit? I was like, are you kidding me? Like, have you seen an axe head? It's long. An axe head can be long, but axe heads aren't wide. They're not fat. They're not like these giant fat sledgehammers. You know what I mean? Axe heads come to a thin point. Once again, yes, the blade itself can be long, like the actual cutting edge. The actual cutting edge of an axe can be long, but it is thin. So I'm like, why would he even say that she would be hit with this axe if her husband, like, no. She wouldn't be hit with this axe unless was the fattest axe on planet Earth, which I don't think it was. It was probably just a normal axe. It's long, yes, but wide, no. The person had to reach across her to hit him. So what? Like, how fat are you when you're laying on your side? From accounts, Margaret Hossack was like, she wasn't like a big woman. It's not like she was a skinny, tiny model size 0, but she's lying on her side. And she's not a ginormous, like, big woman, okay? She's just like a normal sized woman of her age of, 56, lying on her side. Like, you could totally reach over someone when they're lying on their side and hit someone else with an axe. I mean, it doesn't say how long this axe handle was. I'm like, what is it? Like a baby mini axe and the handle's only 6 inches long? No, it's probably it's used for chopping wood. It's probably a couple of feet long at least. And so, of course, you could reach over someone and hit them in the head with an axe and not hit the person sleeping next to them at all, period. That was like George Clammer saying that she couldn't be hit by the axe when she was lying in bed next to him was the weirdest thing to me. Axes, especially like if you're using them for chopping wood, they're like more of a precision tool, right? Because you want to hit the wood that you're trying to chop. You don't want to hit anything else around it. You want to hit the wood. And that's what they're for. So once again, they're aiming for someone's head. There might be a person in between them, but because the axe is longer, you can just reach over and whack down with the axe and smack someone in the head with both ends and not hit another person. I 100% believe that. She could have, let's just pretend that she was in bed. Someone, I believe, totally could have hit her husband without hitting her with an axe. That's what I'm saying. That was like a really long-winded way of saying that. And once again, coming back to could she have slept through it? Possibly. I lean more towards no. But, once I get to the end and tell what happened, you'll see why. But the whole thing where she also woke up and, like, didn't call for her husband, don't find that super strange either. She could have just, like, heard a noise, been like, oh, gonna go see what that is. It's not like every woman in the world who has a husband, when they wake up, is like, you go see what it is. No, not me. You go see what it is. Like, she's lived on this farm for the majority of her life now. Like, this is her farm too. She could have just heard a sound, gotten up in the middle of the night and went and walked out and to see what it was. Like, you don't have to wake your husband up to do that. No. It goes back to this whole thing where, like, well, she was a woman. Why didn't she reach out for her husband when she heard a scary noise in the night? Because not every woman does that, okay? So I think what more is likely to happen, saying that this that this theory of her lying in bed is true, is she probably got up, went out to see what it was, maybe it was like, John, John, and when he didn't respond, went back and was like, crap, something's wrong with him, right? But not waking him up, who cares? Like, literally, who cares? I mean, I do believe the defense when they said that she was a very committed mother. Obviously, I think she was. She stayed with her husband for 32 years, and she had 10 children, 9 of whom survived to adulthood. She took care of them. I have no idea if she was a good mother or not. Based on the fact that her children all came and supported her at her trials, I would say that she was a good mother and that she did take care of them. And she may not have left with them and to get away from their abusive father, but she did try and stand up for them when he was being a horrible person to them. And so, yeah, I'm more likely to believe the defense on that point, where she was a loving mother and she wasn't full of hate. The whole thing about, the friends testifying that things were fine, I already covered that. I think that they could have been living in peace for a year and John could have realized his problems and he could have calmed down. But I also think that because, the neighbors basically told Margaret to never tell us about your problems again, it could have just, once again, the neighbors just didn't hear about it. And so there could have been a lot of friction in their marriage in the year leading up to John Hossack's death. I think the testimony of them being happy on Thanksgiving has not a lot of bearing on the trial, to be honest, at least to me. So last Thanksgiving was bad. Okay, well, this Thanksgiving is better. He's just in one of his good moods this Thanksgiving, and he's happy that it's Thanksgiving. He's happy that his family's here. He's happy that he has a lot of food on the table that he provided by himself because he's John Hossack and he's rich and he has his own farm and he's prosperous. I don't think that really, to me, the whole they've reconciled, not reconciled thing, it's hard for me because once again, they could have, but also Margaret just could have not talked about it because her neighbors told her not to. So I think the testimony of the doctors at the trial, I just can't believe them. None of them had ever seen someone like this. They seem to know, how would they know anything about traumatic brain injuries except from reading books? They've never seen it before. Dr. Dale was one of the guys who said that it would be impossible for John Hossack to speak until the 8 to 10 minutes after the attack. That's pretty specific there. 8 to 10 minutes. Why 8? What does this guy know about traumatic brain injuries and in relation to speech? And so I felt like that the doctor's testimonies for me were just kind of you don't actually know what you're talking about. And that's what I feel like oh my gosh, Barry or Henderson, who was also on the defense team, Henderson kind of hammered home. It didn't obviously work because Margaret was still guilty. But for me, it was well, you've heard about Phineas Gage, right? He had an iron bar blasted through his brain and he could still talk. And Dr. Porterfield was well, I don't know about that. That's an exceptional case. And John Hossack's could have been an exceptional case. He had Dr. Porterfield basically admit that he had never treated a patient with the same injury. His inference was only based on reading. Could he be conclusive? He basically pointed out that the doctor was only guessing about the whole speech thing, about the teacup-sized blood clot on his head. I mean, the doctors just, to me, held absolutely no sway. If I had been there in that jury room, I don't know if I would have believed them because none of them had ever seen this before. They'd never dealt with it before. And once again, I feel especially with traumatic brain injuries, I feel you never know how it's going to affect the person, right? There are some people once again, Phineas Gage had an iron bar blasted through his brain. He was talking. He was fine. He lived for 12 more years. I mean, he wasn't completely fine. He had issues after that, but he was talking. He was conscious right after an iron bar went through his brain. If you can't point to that case as being what the heck, traumatic brain injuries can be so weird in so many different ways, I don't know what else to point you to. Because you don't know how it's going to affect people at all, I feel I mean, probably in today's world there is, and probably brain or neuroscientists or neurodoctors or whatever they're called, I don't know, probably know more today about how things would affect them. But back then, where they've never seen it, they've never dealt with it before, did they even know that much about the human brain in the early 1900s? I have no idea. I just feel their testimonies did nothing for me. And then the evidence of the hair, this... just man, I feel once again, it's all a bunch of BS evidence because they get this guy to look at the hairs, right? John Tilton from Simpson College, who's a geologist. I'm like, what does a geologist know about hair? Am I missing something? Like, did early 1900s geologists know about hair? Like, I get that he's at least some sort of scientist. Like, good for them. He probably has like microscopes and magnifying glasses or whatever, so that he can at least take a closer look at the hair. But I was like, you're sending the hairs off to a geologist? Not any sort of expert that would even know anything about hair, or not even like a biologist, because they were like, yeah, maybe it could be dog hair. I'm like, then send it to like a biologist or someone who studies dogs or animals, or like, nope. And then John Tilton, I mean, in court, he was like, yeah, there's some turkey blood on there, but there could be other blood. It's just every piece of evidence is so inconclusive. There could have been other blood, but I'm not really sure. But my favorite thing was when it came to the hairs. He said the first two were like a dog's, but maybe a human's. But the third one was strange and different from the others. But if they all came from the same place, they must be human. And I was like, dude, you just said the first two were like a dog's hair. So if the first two are like a dog's hair, but the third one's iffy, but you just said they all came from the same place, why did you just jump to the conclusion that they came from a human? Because you just said they could be dog hairs. So it could be from a dog too. Okay? Like, that jump, that was so strange to me. I was like, did you not just hear your own words? Could have been a dog's, but the third one, not sure about. But since it all came from the same place, must be human. Wait, but you just said the first two were probably a dog's. But perhaps a human's, but more like a dog's. Like, just the evidence, like, I would not have been convinced. And I think it's true. Like, when Barry came to the stand and proved that, like, the hairs that Sheriff Hodgson tucked into his pocket and gave to Clammer, who then gave them to Tilton, he couldn't prove that those hairs were the same. Even the ones that they clipped off of John Hossack's head later to compare with them, they couldn't prove that those were the same hairs. Clammer could have switched them out. Clammer could have lost them. The ones that were in the sheriff's pocketbook for 6 to 10 days, like, you're not going to say that they, like, any other hairs or anything else got into his pocketbook during that whole time. Like, nope. I would have not. I don't know if I wouldn't have not allowed it, because I don't know how trials work and how judges or whoever determines what evidence is allowed and isn't allowed because of laws and chain of custody. But that whole hair thing, I was like, not convinced, okay? And once again, could have been a turkey. All that blood on the axe, he admitted there was bird blood, maybe some other blood, but not sure. Just nothing concrete at all. And then, yeah, again, just attacking Margaret and saying she hated her. I just feel like, no. And the fact that, like, Margaret Hossack's story didn't change when Barry questioned her and then Clammer questioned her, except, like, the little bit of time difference when she was churning butter. I feel like if she was guilty, it probably would have changed a little bit, especially if she had been hammered repeatedly by George Clammer, who obviously believed she was guilty. Like, from the get-go, seemed to believe she was guilty. During the trial, seemed to think she was guilty. After the trial and everything happened, still believed she was guilty. So I feel like he would have really torn her apart if she had been guilty. And I feel like maybe something would have changed. But also, I don't see the point in her not admitting to killing her husband if she was guilty. Which is another reason why I think she didn't do it. Not that every guilty person always admits to being guilty, right? But she's already being tried for it. Public already thinks she did it. What's the point in her saying, and not saying she did it? Because she didn't do it, in my opinion. I feel like if she did it, she would have just been like, yeah, I did it. I murdered my husband. He was a horrible person, especially if you believe that she did it because of hate. And then she's over here being like, no, I didn't do it. Like, if she hated her husband, she probably, yeah, I did it. I did it because I hated my husband. I mean, she's complaining about her husband for years. Now she's on trial for her husband's murder, and she's still saying she's innocent. Probably because she didn't do it. I feel like that kind of sums up the trial. Obviously, I was not convinced by anything that anyone presented there. If I had been in the jury, I don't think it is enough evidence to convict her at all. It's all circumstantial. It's all a bunch of, quote, experts that basically William Barry proved weren't experts at all. and Barry and Henderson proved weren't experts at all. And once again, it comes back to that, and also the undergarment. Clean on the front, dirty on the back. How would that have happened if she killed her husband? She went and changed her garment? I don't think so, because they seemed to search the house, even if they didn't really take a lot. All the men seemed to be poking around trying to figure out what happened to John Hossack. And by that, I mean, like, all the men. Like, the neighbors came out and looked at the axe when Johnny found it. I'm like, you're not even part of, like, any sort of law enforcement or law practicing person, but you're like, yeah, this axe out here. And no. I think it was super fascinating, though, that in her second trial, there were more men that thought she was guilty than in her first trial. So in a place where people didn't know about John Hossack, more people found her guilty, which was strange to me because, once again, I don't feel like there's enough evidence. And also, I thought the dumbest evidence at that second trial was George Clammer hitting the bed and the mattress with the axe and being like, look how loud that was. Like, oh my gosh, the whole thing shook. Me sitting here, I'm like, the axe didn't hit the bed frame. The axe hit someone's skull who's sleeping on the bed. Okay, so that's a bit different than having, like, striking an axe directly against the bed frame as opposed to striking something that's on the bed sleeping. Because I do think that would make a big difference. If an axe had been, like, forcibly smashed against the bed frame and it shook like it probably did when the axe hit it, yeah, I think Margaret would have woken up from that. But when it's hitting something that, honestly, compared to a axe head that's used for splitting wood, a skull is probably nothing compared to that physically, strength-wise, obviously. Yeah, it probably wouldn't have shaken the whole bed frame like it did when you hit directly against the bed, because that's not what happened. A body was hit, not the bed. I thought that was, like, the biggest BS in the second trial. Also, just, like, the two new witnesses, didn't really do anything for me. G.K. Burson saying that he saw some dude riding away. I mean, he came out way later. I mean, the trial took place 2 years later. How is he remembering the right night? Could just be making it up because he wants to be part of this sensational trial, you know? And then Will Haynes, yeah, he lied about not wanting to come out and, like, help the children. But him killing John Hossack, I don't think so. Like, yeah, he was sent to an insane asylum, and some people were like, that's probably because he killed him and felt guilty. I was like, I don't see that happening, because I'm almost to, I'll tell you why, because I'm almost to where I'm going to tell you my theory. But I'm going to finish with, I thought what happened to her children was super sad. I thought Margaret losing her farm and losing her land while she's in prison and then having her children scatter was the saddest part of the story. Because, yeah, they all rallied around her for the trial. And then afterwards, they all just dispersed. And she was left to, I'm not going to say be alone, because some of her kids still lived there, but she was. She was alone. And she didn't have a home to go back to. She didn't have her house. She lived in a boarding house for the rest of her life. She had no home of her own. And I think that, and just her children leaving, and so many of them having issues and mental health problems, or marrying people that were like John, and having mental breakdowns, I just thought that was the saddest part of this story. Because I'm close to my family. I love all my siblings. And just to think that you would never see them, especially after such a traumatic event, when having that support there would be helpful, is so sad. And for her to have her land ripped away from her, horrible. It's awful. She comes out of prison for a crime that she probably didn't commit, and everything has been taken from her. Everything. She, yeah, maybe has some money from the sale of the farm, but other than that, she has nowhere to go. She can't go sleep in her own bed. She can't go home and be in her own kitchen and make herself a meal there and just try and calm down and get back to living life as normal, because there's nowhere for her to go. And I just thought that was super sad. I'm trying to scroll through real quick to see if I have any other thoughts, because I did write a bunch of my thoughts down at, like, the bottom. I think, oh yeah, the other thing about the axe that I thought was kind of silly was, like, they were trying to remember if it was inside the granary or outside the granary. And I was like, I can't even remember where I put my glasses sometimes. And like, they're my glasses. I need them to see. And so to try and question people, did you put it in the granary or outside? I get that it's important, but I feel like their answers would mean nothing to me because they'd be like, well, I think I did, but maybe I didn't because I sometimes put it outside. I'm like, yeah, I did, but wait, no, maybe that was a different day. Maybe I put it outside. Like the whole axe in the granary outside was just nope. I think that John Hossack totally could have suffered from some sort of mental illness. I mean, many of her sons and some of her daughters also struggled with mental illness afterwards in life. You know, they were restless. They wandered the country. They worked a lot of different jobs. Two of them died in mental asylums or mental institutions, and so I feel like John Hossack totally could have had some mental issue that made him this raging, horrible, mean person sometimes, and then other times that father that provided for his children and made sure everything was okay. So I think that mental health problems might have been prevalent in this family, but of course, no one was talking about that back then or even knowing what they were. And once again, the tearing apart of the family, I think, is so tragic. I mean, her sitting in prison and learning that her farm is gone, like that would have just crushed me, crushed me, crushed me. I mean, she was just always working. I feel like Margaret was always working. She testified that she was working until like 9 p.m. the night that her husband died. It's like she has to get up in the morning and do all the early morning chores on the farm, and then she's still working at 9 p.m. Like, this woman never, ever got a freaking break. Okay. I was like, ah. Also, just like people were assuming that the loud noise that Margaret Hossack heard that woke her up was the axe hitting her husband. And I don't know why they would assume that. Because it could have been like the front door slamming if someone else came and did it, or the bedroom door being closed, or like it could have been something else, the axe being dropped on the ground while the perpetrator's trying to get away. I thought that was weird that they just assumed that the loud noise that she heard was her husband's head being crushed because also he was hit twice. So wouldn't she have woken up, if that's true, as they assumed, with the first blow and then heard another blow right after it? That was very strange to me. Basically, obviously, I'm just like not convinced by anything that these people told me. Let's see. I think that was pretty much all my thoughts. So now I'm gonna tell you what I think happened. Obviously, I don't know. I'm in the same boat as everyone else where I do not know the answer to this question of who killed John Hossack. And I'm sorry that this is my first podcast and I made it about that because I sometimes really get pissed off where I dedicate all this time and at the end it's like, and we still don't know who it was. The end. Ding. Like that. Ugh. I like resolution. Because I think everyone does, right? I mean, we like some sort of mystery in our life, but when it comes to things like this, we want to know who did it. We want to know who the actual perpetrator was. And we just don't know for this. And here's the thing, though. I mean, I'm going to tell you a couple theories, but I think I'm going to end with the one that I think is probably the most likely. Do I think someone could have come in the house and totally have done it? I think that is the least likely theory, but also it was 1900. It's not like they have DNA testing and they live in the middle of nowhere. So yeah, someone could have just crept into the house, murdered John Hossack in his bed and left and never have been caught. I think it's the least likely just because the amount of people that were in the house, just why would someone come in? I don't think John Hossack had a big enough beef with anyone where someone would come in and kill just him, but leave the rest of his family alive. You know, if it was just some random crazy person coming off the street and deciding to go pick a random farm and kill people, he would have killed the whole family. And so I don't think, yes, I think Margaret could have slept through it because of reasons I've already said. Do I think that's likely? No. So do I also think that it was likely that someone came into the house, some random stranger, and killed him? No, I don't think that. Do I think that it was Margaret? It could have been. But I think, once again, for me, the undergarment was literally like the only evidence that was convincing to me, like 100% convincing, because I don't think she would have changed and in between this and not been able to hide it well enough, if that makes sense. So if she had changed, I feel like the men wandering around her farm being little detectives would have found something if she had changed. And but if she had did it, if she did do it, why was there no blood on the front? So I feel like, honestly, that undergarment to me is the most important, and I feel like it shows that she did not do it because there's no blood on the front. And if she killed her husband and that's what she was wearing when it happened, then it would have been all over the front. And I also just feel like unless something really, really happened that night, she wouldn't have done it. She's lived with this guy for 32 years. Yeah, he's an a-hole. Yes, he goes raging mad sometimes. What caused her to crack? If it was her, what was that moment? What caused her to snap? What caused her to crack after 32 years? And once again, I feel like if it was a split second, like, oh my gosh, I've been living with this for so long. I hate this man. Why only 2 blows? I feel like it would have been blow after blow after blow until he was just decimated. There's nothing left. And, then at that point in time, she might have stumbled back and been like, what have I done? Oh my gosh. But if she really hated him that much, like George Clammer said, 2 blows to the head and then not actually killing him after she sees that he's alive. No, I don't think she did it. I think the most likely theory is that one of her sons did it, or even one of her daughters. Like, I can wield an axe and I can chop wood with an axe, which means that I could drive an axe through someone's skull if I really wanted to. I don't, but I'm just saying, like, that whole perception of women being the weaker sex, I'm like, yeah, if you can lift an axe, you could whack someone with an axe, okay? I mean, the whole Lizzie Borden trial was about Lizzie Borden maybe whacking her stepmother and her father with an axe, and she was like a little woman, but could she still have done it? Yeah, if she can lift the axe, she can whack someone with the axe. But I do think it's more likely that one of her sons did it as opposed to her daughters. I'm not just saying that because they're male. I just feel like they would be more protective of their sisters. And I mean, Johnny had already stood up for his sisters beforehand. Do I think it was Johnny? Like, I have no idea. It could have been any one of the brothers except for Alex. Alex just lived too far away to come into the night, bash his father on the head, go back to his house, and have people like find him there. And I mean, like, that's just such a long journey too. I don't think Johnny necessarily did it because he was farther away at a farm, but he totally could have done it. I think most likely what happened is that one of the sons, tired of their father being a total jerk, killed him. And I think that Margaret actually may have tried to stop that from happening. And that's why there might have been blood on the back of her. Maybe she saw her son come in, tried to stop him. He still went for it. And she kind of, like, realizing that she couldn't stop him, not necessarily cowered in the corner, but was like, oh my gosh, and stepped out of the way. That would explain why there's blood on the back and not the front. Because she would have been trying to get away from her son wielding this axe to chop his father's head. And so I feel like that makes the most sense to me, that one of her children did it and that she was trying to cover for them. Because I do think she was innocent. I think if she did it, she would have admitted it. Like, why not? It's not like she's already lost everything. Why not just say that she's guilty? And I mean, she is the kind of person that's going to tell people, like she did for years. She told people that John was horrible, that he beat the children, that he would throw things at them, that he threatened them, that she worried that one day he might harm them enough to take their lives and things like that. Why, if she hated him that much and she was really worried that much, why wouldn't she just come out and be like, yep, it was me, I saved my children from him? And so I think what's most likely, and once again, because I think the evidence doesn't point to her basically at all, I think the most likely thing is not a stranger coming into the house, but someone who is already in the house, one of her children, coming in and just having enough of their father and killing him, and her covering for him, and them all getting together and making up that story about what happened. Or maybe even not all getting together. If she knew who did it and the person who did it knew who did it, they could have just, gone back up to bed. She made up that whole story. She called them down. They're all there. They're like, oh my, the other children have no idea. What's happening? Oh my gosh, dad's dead. But they would never expect their mother or their brother to do that. And so, and I mean, Margaret said she was innocent until the end. I do think she was covering for someone, and I think that someone was one of her sons because that's how much she loved them. She didn't want them to go to prison for killing their father. She didn't want that reputation. She didn't want that happening to them. Their dad had already been a horrible person to them. She wants her children to still have good lives, and so she covered for them. And I said them at the end. Yeah, like they could have all been involved. It could have been just one of them. It could have been all of them. They could have all decided to collectively get rid of John Hossack, but she took the fall. And I think she did it for her children. However many were involved, however many weren't involved, if it was one of them, if it was all of them, if all of them knew about it, or if just the person who did it knew about it, I think she knows who did it. And we're never going to know, I think, unless someone finds a journal or something, or some other sort of confession that's been suppressed or something and kept by the family because they don't want to like let it go, which I'm like, if you know who it is, just tell us. Like, it's been 123 years since it happened. If you know, just let it go. Let it go into the world. Let people know who did it. But like I said, I feel like the most likely scenario is that her sons did it and she covered for them. And that just breaks my heart because she lost everything because of it. And her family didn't even stay together. It's like she covered for her son. She lost everything, including her sons and her daughters. And I think that's just so tragic. And that is what made me stick with this story. I feel so bad for Margaret Hossack. She was judged. She wasn't listened to. When she was telling about other people about her problems at home, they told her to stop. They told her to listen to her husband, who was an insane, raging person. Like, yes, he may have had mental health issues, but that doesn't give him carte blanche to be horrible, to threaten his children, to say that he's going to gut one of them, to throw things at them, to beat them. Like, that's still not okay in my book. And yes, back in the 1900s, they wouldn't have known how to deal with that. I mean, we're still trying to figure out how to help people with mental health today, right? But that doesn't mean that he gets a pass in my book. Okay? And she was ripped from her family, lived with a husband who was horrible to her, had neighbors who told her to stop and to listen to everything he said, even though he was horrible, to not treat him horribly so he didn't get angry. And she had already given everything to him, literally everything. She gave herself, she gave her time, she gave her children, everything she gave to John Hossack. And in the end, everything was taken from her. And, I mean, even her name. Her niece didn't want to mention it. She was, I don't know if besmirched is a word, but she was, seen as this blight and this dark spot on the family's history that they didn't want to talk about. And so in covering, and most likely what I think in covering for her son and being an innocent woman and being that loving mother that she was, that William Barry said she was, she lost everything. And I just think it is so tragic and just a horrible injustice to her. And the way she was portrayed, the way that she was depicted, the way that she was dragged through the mud without sufficient evidence, the way she was tried and tried again, and finally just let go because, oh, there's not enough evidence, not even saying that she was innocent. Just no resolution whatsoever. That's what made me stick with this story because I feel so, so bad for Margaret Hossack. And I would love to know who killed John Hossack, and I would love to have her name cleared if it wasn't her. But I don't think we're ever going to know. And that is something that people have to live with because that actually happens, probably more often than we think. And that is really sucky and awful. And Margaret Hossack, I think, was that loving mother. And in the end, she had nothing left. And she was buried next to a man who took her away from her family and who treated her horribly. and she was loyal to him. And so I feel like she deserves to be there next to him. But I don't know if he deserves to be there next to her. Thank you so much for listening. This episode was really long and rambling, but I hope everything made sense. If you have any questions, if you have your own thoughts, I would honestly love to hear them. I would love to discuss them with you. I'm on Instagram, TatesAPB, and I have a website, tatesapb.com. You can also reach out to me there. I have a contact form there. Give me all your thoughts. Give me all your theories. Give me all your questions. Come discuss this case with me. Tell me what you think about Margaret Hossack. Tell me what you think about John. Does he get a pass in your book because he maybe had mental illness, or doesn't he? Let me know. I'm super interested. Thank you so much for everyone who listened to this. And yeah, I just want to thank you. Thank you so much. And before you go to bed tonight, think of someone you love and tell them you love them, because you don't know what'll happen in the morning. Your whole life can change. This podcast was written and produced by me, Tate Rudolphi. If you are interested in any of my source materials, please see the podcast description. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share. You can follow this and future podcasts produced by me on my Instagram at Tate Presents. Thank you for listening.